A Spy Called James. The True Story of James Lafayette, a slave who spied for George Washington's army during the American Revolution. Written by Anne Rockwell. Illustrated by Floyd Cooper. On October 19, 1781, the Battle of Yorktown ended with an American victory over British forces. Thanks to the help of French troops, including General Lafayette, the colonists were now poised to win the war they'd been fighting against the British since 1775. With the war's end, America would be a free country. One of the last things British General Cornwallis did before returning to England was to visit Lafayette's camp. Cornwallis wondered how his army of redcoats had been beaten by young French general. The two generals had at least a couple of things in common. Both came from impressive families, and both had impressive names. Cornwallis's full name was Charles Cornwallis, first Marquis and second Earl Cornwallis, Viscount Broome, Baron Cornwallis of Eye. The Frenchman's full name was Marie Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert de Motier, Marquis de Lafayette. In France, his friends called him Gilbert, but in America, he was simply Lafayette. It's easy to imagine that the American Revolution and the fate of the 13 colonies were in the hands of men like these, men whose names were destined to be famous. Franklin, Jefferson, Washington. After all, not long after the war ended, streets, schools, parks, and cities would be named after these men. A list of names had also helped start the war. Many of these famous men signed the Declaration of Independence, telling King George of England the colonies would be free. But America would not have won independence without the courage of thousands of people whose names never became famous. Cornwallis saw one such man in Lafayette's camp during his visit. He must have known in a flash exactly how Lafayette had defeated him. The person Cornwallis saw was known by one name, but without him, the war might have ended very differently. His name was James, and he was enslaved by a Virginia tobacco farmer named William Armistead. James heard that an enslaved man could be granted his freedom by fighting for the colonies. James was interested, and in 1781, Armistead allowed him to join Lafayette to help defeat the British. James was sent to serve under the French general with names to spare. Soon after, James was ordered to spy on the most infamous name in American history. Benedict Arnold began the Revolutionary War on the side of the colonists. He fought bravely in many battles, but Arnold did not feel appreciated. After being passed over for a promotion in 1779, Arnold secretly switched sides. By the next year, he was spying for the British, working against his own commander, General George Washington. Arnold's efforts to aid the British failed, and he was revealed as a spy. He fled to the British Army in the late 1780 before American troops could catch him. Soon, Arnold was fighting again, this time alongside Cornwallis, in battles against the American army. And this is where the infamous spy crossed paths with the spy nobody knew. On orders from Lafayette, James dressed in tatters and presented himself as a runaway slave to Cornwallis and Benedict Arnold. He offered to guide British soldiers along the unfamiliar roads. He foraged for food for the troops. The soldiers accepted his help, but no one paid much attention to him. This was a big mistake. Cornwallis, Arnold, and their other troops said things in front of James that they shouldn't have. James saw secret plans and maps, and then he snuck away and passed on what he heard to Lafayette. The British had such faith in James that they asked him to spy on the Americans for them. James agreed. He carried certain information to Lafayette from the British and gave the British misleading information about American plans. Working as a double agent was incredibly risky. If the British discovered James was a spy, they would do what they did to all spies: hang him immediately. And if American soldiers who didn't know who he was caught him carrying papers to the British, they too might execute James as a spy. But James was never caught. Within a year, the information he passed to Lafayette allowed the colonial army to trap Cornwallis at Yorktown. The British army had no choice but to surrender. James was in Lafayette's camp when Cornwallis paid his visit. No one knows for sure if James saw the look on Cornwallis's face when the general realized who had fooled him. But it's not hard to imagine James would have felt satisfied. The war officially ended in 1783 with American victory. But there was no victory for James. While he received his credit for spying during the war, these activities didn't earn James the freedom he expected. Such freedom was reserved for black soldiers in the American army, not spies. 3 years after the fighting ceased, James was still enslaved. When Lafayette learned about James's circumstances, he was outraged. He gave James a certificate, written in Lafayette's own hand, declaring he should be free. This is to certify that the bearer, by the name of James, has done essential services to me while I had the honor to command in this state. His intelligence from the enemy's camp were industriously collected and most faithfully delivered. He properly acquitted himself with some important commissions I gave him and appears to me entitled to every reward his situation can admit of. Done under my hand, Richmond, November 21st, 1784. Lafayette. 2 years later, the Virginia legislature made James a free man. In tribute to what Lafayette did for him, he took the last name Lafayette. James Lafayette was finally free. Author's note. Much about James Lafayette's life is unknown. He was born into slavery in Virginia in about 1748. From his birth until he was freed, James was owned by William Armistead. During the Revolutionary War, from 1775 to 1783, William Armistead sold military supplies to the American Army. In the summer of 1781, he and James were in Richmond, Virginia, supplying General Lafayette's troops. But Lafayette needed more than just supplies. So Armistead allowed James to join Lafayette, either as a servant or a spy. In all, historians estimate that about 5,000 African Americans fought for the Continental Army. After the war ended in 1783, the state of Virginia emancipated slaves who had enlisted in place of their owners. The Virginia law, however, did not extend to slaves who had served as spies. At about that time, James began seeking freedom for himself. In December 1784, he first petitioned Virginia's General Assembly to grant him free status, but his request was denied. In November of 1786, another petition was presented, this time accompanied by Lafayette's letter praising James for his assistance during the war. The General Assembly approved this second petition, officially freeing James on January 9, 1787. The bill freeing James had a benefit for William Armistead as well. The state of Virginia paid Armistead £250 to compensate him for the loss of his valuable workmen. Presumably, Armistead could use these funds to purchase another slave. So, while James was finally free, the institution of slavery continued. James Lafayette never wrote about his life, but government documents and tax records provide clues about what he did after he was freed. By 1816, he was married and had at least one son. In that year, James purchased 40 acres of farmland near the estate of his former master. Property tax records showed that during his life as a free man, he owned from 1 to 4 slaves. In this era, a free black man owning slaves was not unusual. By the early 1800s, states began paying pensions to soldiers who had served in the Revolutionary War. Because James had not been a soldier, he was not eligible for such payments. So, in 1818, he once again petitioned the General Assembly. He was 70 years old and stated that he was no longer able to make a living as a laborer. The petition was approved and James was given $60 immediately and $40 per year for the rest of his life. James and Lafayette met one last time when Lafayette returned to the United States in 1824. During a celebration at Yorktown, a large crowd, including James, greeted the Frenchman. Lafayette saw James, called to him by name, and the two men embraced. James spent his remaining years on his farm in New Kent County, and he died there on August 9, 1830. At the age of 82. By that time, slavery had been abolished in some northern states, but all enslaved African Americans did not achieve freedom until June 19, 1865, after the end of the Civil War.